What if the hand that built an empire was the very same hand that shattered its future? What if a father, a king, a man who believed himself to be the chosen instrument of God on earth, became the murderer of his own son? Imagine a room, deep within the stone heart of the Kremlin, lit not by the majestic glow of imperial power, but by the flickering, desperate light of a single candle. There is no sound of courtiers or petitioners, only the choked gasp of a dying prince and the horrifying, animalistic wail of his father, the king. This is not a scene from a depraved fantasy. This is a moment etched into the blood-soaked annals of history. A moment so monstrous, so contrary to nature, that it has haunted a nation for nearly 500 years. It is the story of a scepter, once a symbol of divine right and absolute authority, becoming a crude, bloodied murder weapon in the hands of the man who was meant to wield it for justice. We are not just talking about a king who lost his temper. We are talking about a cataclysmic act that ripped a hole in the fabric of a dynasty, an act of filicide that would echo through the centuries, leaving behind a question that chills the soul: how does a man become a monster to his own blood? Before you dismiss this as the simple act of a madman, you must understand who this king was. He was not born a monster. He was Ivan IV Vasilievich, known as Ivan Grozny, a name often translated as terrible, but which more accurately means formidable, awe-inspiring, or thunderous. He was a brilliant legislator, a devoutly religious man, a military strategist who doubled the territory of his nation, transforming a fractured principality into the Tsardom of Russia, a vast and powerful empire. He was a patron of the arts, a man of letters, and for a time, a beloved ruler. But within this same man, this architect of a nation, there lurked a darkness of profound and terrifying depth. It was a darkness born in a childhood of terror, nurtured by betrayal and paranoia, and finally unleashed upon his own people, his own court, and ultimately, his own family. His reign was a paradox written in blood and gold, a testament to the terrifying duality of human nature. He built Russia with one hand and tore its soul apart with the other. This is not merely a story of a historical event. It is an autopsy of a soul, a psychological deep dive into the abyss where power, piety, and paranoia collide with catastrophic force. We will walk the cold corridors of the Kremlin in your imagination. We will stand in the shadows as a father's love curdles into a murderous rage, and we will confront the chilling aftermath of an act that no crown could justify and no prayer could erase. We will peel back the layers of propaganda, myth, and madness to ask a question that is as relevant today as it was in the 16th century. What happens when the systems designed to protect a nation's future are embodied in a single, flawed, and breaking mind? Prepare yourself, for we are about to descend into the heart of one of history's most formidable and tragic figures, into the story of Ivan the Terrible and the son he was destined to kill. The past is never as distant as it seems, and its screams can still be heard if you listen closely enough. To understand the monster, you must first understand the boy. Ivan was born in 1530, a prince of Muscovy, destined for greatness, but fate dealt him a cruel hand early on. His father died when he was just 3. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, a capable and cunning regent, was wrested from him by a suspected poisoning when he was 8. The young Ivan and his deaf-mute brother Yuri were left orphans, pawns in a vicious game of thrones played by the boyar clans, the powerful nobles of Russia. Imagine being a child, the rightful ruler of the land, yet utterly powerless. Imagine living in the vast, cold Kremlin, not as a palace, but as a prison. Ivan later wrote of his childhood, recalling how he and his brother were neglected, dressed in rags, and often went hungry. More terrifyingly, he was a spectator to the brutal reality of power. He witnessed the boyars' cruelty firsthand, the casual arrests, the secret murders, the open contempt for his royal authority. They would burst into his private chambers, drunk and boisterous, propping their dirty boots on his father's bed. He learned his first lesson not in governance, but in terror. He learned that power was not a right. It was a weapon to be seized and wielded without mercy. This crucible of fear and humiliation did not simply shape him. It forged him. It instilled in him a searing hatred for the boyars and a deep, gnawing paranoia that would become the defining feature of his life. So when he was crowned at 16, taking the title Tsar of all Russia for the first time in history, it was not just a political act. It was an act of vengeance. He was no longer the neglected orphan. He was Ivan Grozny. And the boyars would soon learn the meaning of his name. In his early reign, this energy was channeled productively, guided by his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, and a council of skilled advisors. He enacted sweeping reforms. He created a new, comprehensive legal code, the Sudebnik of 1550, which centralized state power and limited the authority of the nobles. He established the Zemsky Sobor, the first Russian parliament of its kind, and reformed the military. He was a builder, a modernizer, a visionary. The love for his wife Anastasia seemed to be a balm on his wounded soul. With her, he had several children, including his bright and promising heir, the Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, born in 1554. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the traumatized boy had grown into a great and just king. Russia was ascending, and the Tsar was its formidable but stable leader. It was a fragile peace, a thin layer of ice over a volatile sea of memory and rage. The breaking point, the moment the ice shattered, came in 1560. His beloved Anastasia fell ill and died. For Ivan, this was no natural death. In his paranoid mind, haunted by the memory of his mother's fate, there was only one explanation: the boyars had poisoned her. "If you had not taken my heifer from me," he would later scream at his nobles, "there would have been no storms." The death of Anastasia unleashed the storm that had been brewing in him since childhood. The grief-stricken Tsar descended into a spiral of depression and paranoia that warped him from a reformer into a tyrant. This transformation was formalized in 1565 with the creation of the Oprichnina. This was a terrifying masterstroke of political terror. Ivan divided Russia into two parts: the Zemshchina, the public land ruled by the boyars, and the Oprichnina, his own personal domain, a state within a state. To run it, he created a personal guard of about 6,000 men. The Oprichniki, dressed in black, riding black horses, they became the specter of death haunting Russia. Their emblem was a dog's head, symbolizing their mission to sniff out and devour the traitors of the Tsar, and a broom to sweep them from the land. They were a law unto themselves, accountable only to Ivan. They unleashed a reign of terror that lasted for 7 years. Boyar families were purged, their lands confiscated, their families executed with grotesque cruelty. The violence was not confined to the nobility. In 1570, Ivan, believing the city of Novgorod was planning to defect to Lithuania, led the Oprichniki in a month-long massacre. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children were tortured and slaughtered. Priests were flogged to death. People were tied to sleighs and dragged into the freezing Volkhov River. Ivan, it was said, would watch the tortures, sometimes participating, all while engaging in fervent prayer, convinced he was doing God's righteous work. Growing up in the shadow of this terror was his son, the Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich. He was everything a Tsar could want in an heir: intelligent, physically strong, a capable military commander who had participated in his father's wars. He was devout like his father, but by some accounts, he also possessed a streak of his father's cruelty. Yet, he was the future. He was the continuation of the Rurik dynasty. He was the one person who should have been safe from the Tsar's rage. But in the world his father had created, a world where loyalty was proven by absolute, silent submission, even a worthy son could become just another perceived threat. The air in the Kremlin was thick with the scent of blood and fear, and the Tsarevich was breathing it in every single day. The final act of this tragedy took place in November of 1581 within the claustrophobic, fortified walls of the Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, Ivan's preferred residence and the de facto capital of the Oprichnina. The Livonian War, a grueling 25-year conflict, was going poorly, draining the treasury and the morale of the nation. The Tsar, now 51, was increasingly erratic, his health failing, his temper more volcanic than ever. The heir, Ivan Ivanovich, was 27, in the prime of his life. The most widely accepted account of that fateful day, chronicled by the papal emissary Antonio Posavino based on court testimony, is a tale of domestic discord spiraling into dynastic catastrophe. It began with the Tsar's third daughter-in-law, Yelena Sheremeteva, the Tsarevich's wife. Ivan the Heir, in a fit of piety or rage, stormed into her chambers and found her immodestly dressed by the standards of the time she was pregnant, and likely wearing only a single layer of undergarments. Resting, the Tsar exploded in fury. He began to beat her, striking her with his heavy hand. The pregnant Yelena collapsed, and the assault resulted in a miscarriage, extinguishing a potential heir. Hearing his wife's screams, the Tsarevich rushed in. He confronted his father, pleading for his wife. "You sent my first wife to a convent for no reason," he cried. "You have done the same with my second, and now you strike my third, and kill the son she carries in her womb." The argument escalated. The Tsarevich, desperate and bold, challenged his father not just on the assault, but on his disastrous handling of the war, demanding he be given command of troops to relieve the besieged city of Pskov. For the Tsar, this was the ultimate betrayal. This was not a son's plea, it was a challenge to his authority, an echo of the boyar defiance he had spent his life crushing. In a blind, uncontrollable rage, the man who was God's anointed ruler, the formidable Tsar, did the unthinkable. He raised his scepter, a long, heavy staff pointed with iron, and struck his son a fatal blow to the temple. The sound of the impact, a sickening crack, instantly shattered the rage. The Tsar's eyes, a moment before blazing with fury, were now wide with dawning, absolute horror. The Tsarevich collapsed, blood pouring from the wound. And in that moment, Ivan the Terrible ceased to be a Tsar. He was just a father, a murderer, holding his dying child. He threw himself onto his son, kissing the bloody wound, trying to stop the bleeding, screaming for his physician, crying out, "I have killed my son, I have killed my son." For 4 days, the Tsarevich lingered. For 4 days, the Tsar never left his side, praying, weeping, and howling in a grief as monumental as his rage had been. But no prayer could undo the deed. Ivan Ivanovich, The heir to all of Russia died in his father's arms. The future of the Rurik dynasty died with him. In the silent, horrified halls of the Sloboda, a new, terrible quiet fell. It was the sound of a future being erased. If you were the Tsarevich, a man trained for power yet living under the shadow of a terrifying father, would you have dared to defend your wife? Would you have spoken up? Knowing the volcano you were tempting, comment your thoughts below. We stand now in the rubble of that moment. A dynasty is broken. A father is a murderer. An empire is left without its chosen heir. And the question that rises from the blood on the floor is a simple, yet profound. Why, how does it come to this? How could a man of such proven intelligence, a ruler who so profoundly believed in his divine mission to protect and shepherd Russia, commit an act so fundamentally destructive to everything he had built? This was not the execution of a distant, plotting boyar. This was not a calculated political purge of a rival. This was his son, his flesh and blood, his namesake, the vessel of his legacy. The act defies simple political logic. To kill your competent heir and leave your kingdom to a younger, reportedly simple-minded and physically weak son, Fyodor, is not just a crime. It is an act of supreme political self-sabotage. It is the action of a man at war, not just with his enemies, but with his own future, with the very concept of his own continuation. To try and understand, we must attempt to step into the labyrinth of Ivan's mind. From his perspective, steeped in the doctrine of absolute monarchy and divine right, his authority was not just political, it was sacred. He was God's regent on earth. Therefore, any challenge to his will, any defiance, was not merely insubordination, it was blasphemy. It was an affront to God's established order. When his son dared to challenge him, first over his wife and then over military strategy, did Ivan see his son? Or did he see the ghost of the treacherous boyars from his youth? Did he see a loved one's concern? Or did he see a challenge to his God-given authority in a mind marinated in decades of paranoia, where every shadow held a potential assassin and every whisper was a potential plot? The line between family and foe could blur and vanish in an instant. Perhaps, in that moment of rage, the Tsarevich ceased to be his son and became, in his father's twisted perception, the ultimate traitor, the one closest to him, the one who could usurp him. The murder, then, could be seen as the ultimate tragic expression of his political philosophy. Absolute power demands absolute submission, and any who defy it, even a son, must be annihilated. Yet, this political explanation feels incomplete. It cannot account for the immediate, profound, and reportedly genuine grief that followed. The man who ordered the massacre of thousands at Novgorod without flinching was shattered by this single death. The howls of anguish, the desperate attempts to save his son, the subsequent period of intense penance and prayer. This is not the behavior of a man who has just made a cold, calculated political move. This brings us to a more terrifying problem. We are forced to confront the possibility that two opposing forces resided within the same man, Ivan the Pious, God-fearing father, and Ivan the merciless, paranoid tyrant. The act of filicide was not a victory for one over the other. It was the moment they collided with such force that they destroyed the man himself. The central conflict wasn't between the Tsar and his son. It was between the warring halves of the Tsar's own soul. The tragedy is not just that he killed his son. It is that, in doing so, the builder, the father, the man who loved, was forced to stare into the eyes of the monster he had become. The question, why then, is not just about history or politics. It's a deep, unsettling question about the nature of the human psyche itself. How much trauma, power, and fear can one mind endure before it breaks and turns its destructive force inward? For centuries, the story was left to the realm of history and morality, explained away as an act of madness. But modern science allows us to perform a kind of psychological and forensic autopsy from a distance of 450 years. Let's first look through the lens of psychology. Ivan's biography is a textbook case for the development of severe personality disorders. His childhood marked by parental loss, neglect, and constant exposure to violence and betrayal is a perfect storm for complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD. This condition is characterized by profound difficulties in emotional regulation, distorted perceptions of others, and persistent feelings of being threatened. Furthermore, his behavior aligns chillingly with narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. This includes an inflated sense of self-importance, his divine right, a desperate need for admiration, a lack of empathy for others, and, most critically, narcissistic rage. This is not normal anger. It is a terrifying, explosive fury triggered by a perceived slight or challenge to their fragile self-esteem. When his son, his heir, defied him, it wasn't just an argument, it was a deep narcissistic injury, a challenge to his very core of being the infallible, God-chosen ruler. The assault wasn't a punishment, it was a pathological, uncontrolled explosion of a fragile ego built on a foundation of childhood trauma. His entire life was a battle to control a world he felt was constantly trying to betray him. And his son's defiance was the ultimate, unbearable betrayal. Beyond psychology, there is compelling physical evidence. Let's move from the mind to the body, to the very bones of the Tsar. In 1963, Soviet scientists were granted the extraordinary opportunity to exhume the remains of Ivan and his sons from their tombs in the Cathedral of the Archangel in Moscow. The forensic analysis of Ivan's skeleton yielded a startling discovery: his bones contained abnormally high levels of mercury. The concentration was many times higher than what would be considered safe, high enough to suggest chronic mercury poisoning. Where did this mercury come from? In the 16th century, mercury was a common and highly toxic cure for a variety of ailments, most notably syphilis, which some historians speculate Ivan may have contracted. We cannot know for sure why he was taking it, but we know he was, and we know the devastating effects of mercury poisoning on the central nervous system. The symptoms of Mad Hatter disease, as it was known, are a terrifying match for Ivan's later behavior: severe emotional lability, anxiety, paranoia, memory loss, and sudden, explosive, unpredictable fits of rage. So was the Tsar's madness purely psychological, or was his traumatized mind being further poisoned by the very medicine meant to heal his body? This discovery doesn't excuse his actions, but it adds a horrifying new layer. His rage may not have been just a product of his will. It may have been chemically fueled, a toxic firestorm in his brain that made the final fatal explosion almost inevitable. He wasn't just a tyrant. He may have been a man physically and mentally disintegrating. Finally, let's pull the lens back to view the system Ivan himself created, through the perspective of sociology and political science. An individual, even a poisoned and traumatized one, does not act in a vacuum. He acts within a culture. Ivan had spent decades meticulously building a political culture of absolute fear. The Oprichnina was not just a secret police force. It was a social engineering project designed to obliterate dissent and normalize brutal violence as a political tool. In this world, trust was a fatal liability. Normal human relationships of friendship, counsel, and even family were corroded and replaced by a simple, brutal dynamic, the all-powerful master and the terrified subordinate. When you create a system where your every word is law and every whim is met with immediate, unquestioning obedience, you destroy the feedback mechanisms that govern normal human interaction. No one could tell Ivan no. No one could advise him to show restraint. No one could mediate a family argument. In this suffocating echo chamber of his own making, the Tsar was utterly alone with his rage and his paranoia. The murder of his son, therefore, can be seen as the system turning on itself. It was the logical, if tragic, conclusion of a political experiment in absolute power. When the heir, the one person who should have been a partner in power, acted with a shred of independent humanity, the system identified him as an anomaly, a threat, and eliminated him. The tragedy is that the executioner was his own father, the architect of the very system that demanded the sacrifice. The story of a father destroying his own child is a wound in the human psyche so deep that it echoes not just through history, but through our oldest myths. Before Ivan raised his scepter, the Greek titan Cronus, fearing a prophecy that he would be overthrown by his children, devoured each of them as they were born. King Laius of Thebes, hearing a similar prophecy, ordered his infant son, Oedipus, to be left on a mountainside to die. In the same era as Ivan, King Philip II of Spain, a monarch as powerful and devout, imprisoned his own unstable son and heir, Don Carlos, who died in mysterious circumstances, fueling rumors of a royal command. What is this recurring, nightmarish archetype telling us? It speaks to a primal fear at the dark heart of power and legacy, the fear of being replaced. The terror that the future you are building, embodied by your own child, will ultimately erase you. The son becomes a living memento mori, a reminder of the father's own mortality. For a ruler like Ivan, an autocrat whose identity was completely fused with his power, the rise of a competent, popular son could be perceived not as a comfort, but as an existential threat. The filicide of Ivan, then, transcends its historical context and becomes a brutal allegory for the terrifying, self-destructive jealousy that power can breed, the jealousy of the present against the future. This forces us to confront a timeless philosophical question, one famously articulated by Lord Acton: power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Was Ivan's tragedy inevitable? Is it possible for any human being to wield the kind of untethered, godlike authority that a 16th-century Tsar possessed, without it fundamentally poisoning their soul? Power on that scale isolates. It detaches a ruler from the shared humanity of their subjects. Their reality becomes a distorted reflection of their own will. When there is no one to challenge you, to question you, to ground you in reality, the mind can become an echo chamber for its own worst impulses. Ivan's piety, his belief that he was God's chosen, may have been the most corrupting influence of all. If you truly believe your actions are divinely sanctioned, what crime is beyond justification? The murder of his son becomes the ultimate test case for Acton's axiom. The absolute power he held to protect his realm became the absolute power to destroy his own family. It suggests that the price of becoming a god among men is to risk becoming a monster to those you should love the most. The crown, meant to ennoble, instead became a crushing weight that shattered his humanity. And what, then, of legacy? A person's life is a story they write, and a ruler's legacy is the story that survives them. Ivan the Terrible dedicated his life to a singular, ambitious project, the creation of a powerful, centralized, and unified Russian state. He broke the back of the Tartars. He expanded Russia's borders to the east, and he forged a national identity that persists to this day. By these metrics, his legacy should be one of a great, if brutal, nation-builder. Yet, all of these grand achievements are forever footnoted, forever overshadowed by one savage, intimate act of violence in a dimly lit room. He won the war for Russia's future, but murdered that future in his own home. He secured the state but sundered his dynasty, a decision that plunged Russia directly into the catastrophic civil war known as the Time of Troubles, after the death of his childless son Fyodor. This forces us to ask a deeply philosophical question about what constitutes a meaningful legacy. Are we the sum of our grandest achievements, or are we defined by our most profound failures? Does building a cathedral of state matter if you destroy the family within your own house? The story of Ivan teaches a bitter lesson, that the narratives of power and glory are fragile, and they can be irrevocably stained by a single, human, and monstrous moment of weakness. It is easy to confine this story to the barbaric 16th century, to see it as a relic of a distant, unenlightened time. We no longer have czars with iron scepters, we tell ourselves. But to do so is to miss the point entirely. The specific instruments of power change, but the dark psychology of power and abuse is timeless. The core dynamics of Ivan's story replicate themselves endlessly in the modern world, albeit in different forms. Think of the tyrannical CEO who creates a corporate culture of fear, where dissent is professional suicide and loyalty is measured by sycophancy. Their oprichniki are not men in black robes, but a clique of ruthless executives who enforce the leader's will, purging anyone who dares to challenge the company's direction. Think of the abusive family patriarch who rules his home with an iron fist, whose unpredictable rage and emotional manipulation create a miniature police state around the dinner table. To his family, his authority feels as absolute and his rages as terrifying as any czar's. On a larger scale, we see the ghost of Ivan in modern dictators who demand absolute loyalty, who see conspiracies in every shadow, who purge their inner circles, and who justify their brutality with appeals to national security or ideological purity. The technology has changed, but the pattern of the paranoid autocrat, isolated by their own power and waging war on perceived traitors, is a story that repeats with terrifying regularity on the nightly news. Ivan's story also serves as a stark historical argument for one of the most critical developments of the modern era, the recognition of mental health, especially in our leaders. In the 16th century, there was no vocabulary for CPTSD, no diagnosis for narcissistic personality disorder, no understanding of how chemical poisoning could ravage the brain. Ivan's behavior was simply attributed to madness, a divine curse, or a terrible nature. Today, we have the scientific framework to understand, if not excuse, the forces that may have been at play. We scrutinize the psychological fitness of our leaders. We debate the impact of stress, trauma, and ego on decision-making that affects millions. Ivan's story is a case study from the ultimate unregulated environment. He possessed absolute power with zero psychological oversight. There were no checks and balances, not just on his political power, but on his deteriorating mental state. His tragedy underscores the profound danger of placing the fate of a nation in the hands of a single, unchecked, and potentially unwell individual. It validates our modern instinct that the psychological stability of those in power is not a private matter. It is a subject of utmost public concern. The health of a leader and the health of a nation are inextricably linked. Finally, let's ask ourselves a deeply uncomfortable question. What is the mercury of our time? What are the subtle poisons we are ingesting that might be warping our own perceptions? Fueling our own rages, Ivan's paranoia was fed by the whispers of a cloistered, treacherous court. Today, our paranoia is fed by the algorithmically curated echo chambers of social media, which are designed to confirm our biases and amplify our outrage. Ivan's sense of reality was distorted by absolute power. Ours is distorted by a deluge of misinformation, fake news, and curated online personas that make it increasingly difficult to distinguish truth from fiction. The pressure of his crown was immense. The pressure we face from a 24/7 news cycle, constant connectivity, and the demand for instant judgment creates its own form of intense psychological strain. We may not be taking literal mercury as medicine, but we are all exposed to a daily dose of ideological toxins that can breed division, suspicion, and a kind of low-grade, collective madness. Ivan's story is a warning that any society, or any individual, can be poisoned. It urges us to be vigilant about the toxins in our own environment, the ideologies, the technologies, the social pressures that might be pushing us, and our leaders, towards our own destructive breaking points. One small, unexamined dose at a time. In the end, we are left standing before Ilya Repin's monumental 19th century painting of the event. All the history, the psychology, the science fades away, and we are left with that one horrifying image: the father's eyes. They are not the eyes of a triumphant tyrant. They are wide, bulging, insane with grief and the sudden, crushing understanding of what he has done. He clutches his son with a tenderness that is rendered grotesque by the blood on his hands. History offers us theories: a political struggle, a fit of rage, a poisoned mind. But it can never truly take us inside that room in that final, fatal moment. The ultimate why remains locked away in the past, an eternal silent scream in the heart of Russian history. The story of Ivan is so compelling not because he was a one-dimensional monster, but because he was terrifyingly human. His story is a testament to the frightening fragility of the mind. Even the most brilliant and powerful, when placed under the unbearable pressures of trauma, power, and paranoia, the consequences of this single blow rippled outward like a shockwave. With the competent Ivan Ivanovich dead, the throne passed to his younger brother, Fyodor I. Fyodor was a gentle and pious soul, but he was ill-suited for the brutalities of ruling. He was reportedly intellectually disabled and had no interest in governance, leaving the state in the hands of his manipulative brother-in-law, Boris Godunov. When Fyodor died childless in 1598, the ancient Rurik dynasty, which had ruled Russia for over 700 years, came to an end. The murder of the son was the prelude to the death of a dynasty. What followed was the time of troubles, a 15-year period of famine, civil war, foreign invasion, and social collapse. An entire nation paid the price for a father's uncontrollable rage. The stability Ivan had spent his entire life building, through conquest and terror, was ultimately undone by his own hand. A single moment of personal failure led to a generation of national catastrophe. The story of Ivan the Terrible is not just history. It is a dark mirror. It reflects the potential for monstrosity that lies within the human heart, the corrupting nature of absolute power, and the devastating, long-lasting consequences of a single, uncontrolled moment. We have examined the evidence from history, psychology, and forensics, but the final verdict is always yours. What do you believe was the primary force behind this horrific act? Was it a cold, political calculation to eliminate a rival, a tragic accident born of a mind unhinged by trauma and poison? Or was it the inevitable endpoint of a system built on absolute fear? Leave your verdict, your theory, in the comments below. The past is a courtroom, and every generation is the jury. And if you wish to continue our descent into the hidden, often terrifying, stories that have shaped our world, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell for more from the hidden past.